what's going on in the world today ain't exactly clear. All I know is I can't believe anything that you hear. Vigilant Alaskan, bringing you truth in the last frontier. All right, we are here with Brad Keithley. He is the director over at Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Brad, how are we doing this morning?
Matt, we're doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Like I said, really looking forward to having you on. You do great work, but sometimes acronyms and everything, it's hard to keep straight. So, so yeah, just give us a little background on what you guys do over there and how you got into this, and maybe your background professionally as well.
Sure. Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets was formed in 2012, when even then we could see the writing on the wall in terms of spending exceeding revenues. And the goal at the time was to find ways to curb spending and bring us back into alignment with the revenue base that we had at the time, which was traditional revenues plus whatever portion of the permanent fund earnings was not taken for the PFD. We kept going like that till about 2016, and then we sort of hit a break point because at that point, spending was outstripping revenues by a wide margin, and people were starting to talk about using PFD cuts to fund the budget deficit. And to me, that was a break point because it was a question of, do we use PFD cuts, or if spending is going to keep going, do we use some other revenue source? And some in the group wanted to use PFD cuts, and I wanted to use other revenue sources, other less regressive revenue sources. And so we sort of a group of us parted ways and went on talking about the things we talk about. The goal of the group is to develop a budget that's sustainable in a way that's best for the Alaska economy, the overall Alaska economy, and Alaska families. That's the goal. It's not just to get a sustainable budget. You can do that with PFD cuts. You can have revenues equal spending, but it's to do it in a way that has the lowest adverse impact on the overall Alaska economy and Alaska families.
Awesome. Yeah, that really is the the bread and butter. And again, this is a topic that I don't think many people are familiar with, or at least not as familiar as they should be. Now, when you say other revenue sources, to me, whenever I hear people in government talk about revenue, that just means taxes. Is there? But I understand Alaska is probably a little different in that aspect because of the oil, or
Well,
something like that. Or what do you mean by that?
we are talking about taxes, but PFD cuts are taxes.
Yeah, yeah,
One
absolutely.
of the best economists, one of the economists that studied this most at the University of Alaska Institute of Social and Economic Research, last year in an op-ed in the Anchorage Daily News said, "Let's be honest, PFD cuts are taxes, the most regressive tax ever proposed." So
Mhm.
we're not talking about PFD cuts versus taxes. We're talking about taxes to
Right.
fill the budget hole, and PFD cuts is one way, but they are the most regressive. That is, they take most from middle and lower income Alaska families, least from the
Mhm.
upper income Alaska families, and have the largest adverse impact on the overall Alaska economy of the options, and are by far the most costly for Alaska families. So we, the other revenue options are taxes. They're individual taxes, or they'd
Yeah.
be taxes on the oil companies, increased taxes on the oil companies. But that's really no different in terms of calling something a tax than PFD cuts.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. No, that makes perfect sense. So I've heard you talk in other interviews about something, the CBR, the Constitutional Budget Reserve.
Right.
Can you just talk a little bit about what that is and so where that money comes from, and just kind of what I don't know, how they're using that probably inappropriately.
So the Constitutional Budget Reserve was established by constitutional amendment. It was to be a pot into which revenues from settlements with the oil companies over oil taxes, the settlement amounts were to go into that pot. The settlements usually look number of years in arrears.
Mm.
And so rather than just throw that in lump sum, those settlements in lump sum into the general fund and let them be spent, they created this separate pot, the Constitutional Budget Reserve, into which those settlements go. By the constitutional provision, that amount it can be taken by appropriation from the legislature, but it has to be refilled. The problem with that constitutional provision is it doesn't say at what rate over what time it has to be refilled.
Mm.
So what
Mm.
happened in the early
I see.
20 teens is when we started running these huge deficits. The legislature first went to what's called the statutory budget reserve, which doesn't have a refilling obligation, and drained that down.
Mm.
Then they started into the constitutional budget reserve, which they could, but they started draining it down in a way. It was about $12 billion at the time. Started draining it down and draining it down and draining it down, and haven't refilled it.
Mm.
What the CBR is intended for is to be a pot of money that each generation can look to when they get into the fiscal problems that each generation usually faces.
Right.
And it's intended to be refilled so that future generations have the same opportunity to use the CBR as this generation has. What this
Mm.
generation's done is drained it down, not refilled it, and we're leaving future generations with this savings account that has an IOU in it as
Right.
opposed to actual dollars.
And is that supposed to be refilled like with budget surplus or something? That's the idea?
The idea is to refill it with budget surpluses. Exactly.
Wow.
The
Yeah. Yeah.
thought was,
Wait, what are those?
well, yeah, I mean, when we've had budget surpluses since that time, since we drained it down, we've just spent it
Yeah.
as
Right.
opposed
Okay. Yeah.
as
That's
opposed to putting it into as opposed to putting in a great example is 2021, I think it was, when oil prices spiked and we had this huge budget surplus. What happened was we just appropriated it to capital spending as opposed to putting that money into new capital spending, as opposed to putting that money into the constitutional budget reserve.
hmm, interesting. Yeah. Like I said, the surplus that there's that we can't have that. That's we have to max everything out every year. Um. Okay. Well. Let's see here. So, I also hear you talk about the Hammond's vision for the PFD. Can you just lay out what that is, and then maybe where we're at now and what's led to that?
Sure. So the Hammond vision, as when the permanent fund was established in 1976, Governor Hammond subsequently laid out a vision of taking half the permanent fund earnings, half the earnings from the permanent fund, to go to the PFD to be distributed to the people in the form of a permanent fund dividend, and the other half to be available for government in the event government ever fell short. And it was a 50-50 vision, dividing the money between the people individually, and putting the money aside for government. What happened that lasted from roughly 1984, when the PFD was initially, well, actually 1982, and then subsequently redone in 1984. From 1984 until 2016, it lasted 22 years. And then what happened was we started having deficits that couldn't be filled from the statutory budget reserve, which had been drained, couldn't be filled any longer from the constitutional budget reserve, which had been drained. So the extra money had to come from someplace in order to continue spending. And in 2016, Governor Bill Walker decided that it needed to come from the PFD by cutting the PFD. And so since that time, in the 9 years since that time, it's been used. PFD cuts have been used as the revenue source to fill the budget, or to balance the budget. And the consequence of that is we've gone from 50-50, which was the original Hammond vision, down to something like 25-75, which is 25% for the people and 75% for government.
No, I can imagine that. Yeah, that's terrible. Hammond, Walker really a villain in the recent Alaskan history. Um, so so as far as I understand it, the PFD comes from the money made off of the state oil stuff, and so what one of the things that is gonna again be huge for Alaska, and really is my main issue when it comes to our federal representatives, is our resource development and kind of we have to go get permission to do whatever exploration or develop this or that resource. And I've been trying to if I understand why that is. Can you help me with that at all?
Why we have to go to the federal government?
Yeah.
Well, there's two reasons. One, huge parts of Alaska are federal lands owned by the
Right.
federal government.
Yeah.
At statehood, they were retained by the federal government as opposed to sold into the private sector or given to the state. So
Mhm.
some huge amount of Alaska lands are federal lands, and you can't do development. I mean, just like any landowner, you can't do
Right.
development
Yeah.
on their land without
Right.
their approval. And so the federal
Mhm.
government has approval. And that is true of ANWR on the east of the North Slope, and
Mhm.
NPRA, National Petroleum Reserve, Alaska, on the west of the North Slope.
Mhm.
And then the second overlay is we have federal regulation. We have federal regulation of waters. We have federal regulation of air. We have federal regulation of a variety of things. And even on state lands, you have to get certain federal approvals before you engage. You have to get federal approvals before you engage in certain activities. So that's the second layer that applies even to the development of state lands.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think it's probably a good time to go to the charts you gave me here, just to kind of demonstrate for everyone what it is that you're talking about. So let's see here. We got this one here that is the
Yeah.
just showing the just budget spending by revenue source, and this is for next year.
No, well, this is for the year that we're in now. FY25
Yeah.
started July 1. So
Right.
that shows the amount of spending of the revenues that are paying for spending. And it really shows how deep we've become reliant, how deep the budget hole has become, and how much we're taking away from the PFD. On the right-hand side in the blue is the amount of traditional revenues that we're receiving from oil taxes and from other taxes and fees that we're getting into the budget. And that only covers about 50% of spending.
Mm.
Sources from traditional revenues cover about 50% from spending. The other 50% needs to come from someplace else. About 24% of it comes from the portion of permanent fund earnings that by statute are set aside for government. You recall we were
Okay.
talking about the Hammond 50/50,
Yeah.
and about half of the half that goes to government is covering about 25% of the budget. That still leaves a
Mm.
huge budget hole.
Yeah.
The budget hole in Alaska is about the same size as the federal budget hole. The
Mm.
federal budget hole is about 25% of spending. That's about the same size. 25% of spending is about the same size as the Alaska budget hole. And
Mm.
what the portion in red is showing that hole, all of that hole, being filled through PFD cuts. PFD cuts are filling about 25% of the budget. The PFD cuts for FY25 at least are about 1.4 billion.
Mm.
So that shows you, I mean, from the beginnings of where we started into this into 2016, the amount that government has become reliant on PFD cuts, the size of the budget, and the amount that's become reliant on PFD cuts has become huge.
Yeah, I mean, it was 50% over the spending on their that's the thing. The federal government doesn't have a PFT fund. I'm kind of shocked they haven't started to steal ours, to be honest. So
Well, so the federal government covers their 25% hole through debt, through borrowings.
right, okay.
We cover our 25% through PFD cuts. They're taking it directly out of the hands
Well, at
of
least we,
Alaska families and transferring it to government.
yeah, at least we have something tangible, I guess. One way to look at it. So yeah, just going to right into the next one. Then it's a great segue. Is this is showing the cuts over time and how that has just basically increased and in the percentage that they're taking. Like I said, when you look at that top number, it really just it's infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, people say we've got a balanced budget. We don't. We have a budget that has a 25% hole in it, and we're filling it by saying that PFD cuts are taxes. They are taxes. We're filling it by taxes on Alaska families, filling that 25% of the hole by taxes through PFD cuts and taking that money out of the hands of Alaska families.
Yeah, and almost like you've done this before. Great segue into the next chart, right here. Yeah, is that was showing them that one. This one here is showing the how it affects income bracket by income bracket, and by the time you get down to the lower and middle, I mean it's 15%, and right now that's huge.
Yeah, Matt, I'm not seeing that chart on the screen. I'm still
Okay,
seeing the pie
okay.
chart on the screen.
All right, I was worried about that. Let's see here. Why isn't it? Give me a second here. Here we go. Here's the
All right, this is
this is the
before we go
okay.
to the next one,
Yeah,
this chart shows the amount of PFD cut by year.
right.
It's showing how much of the PFD is being taken to fill in the hole of the budget.
Yeah.
And roughly it's 50% of the PFD has been cut and diverted to government to cover the hole. The other 50% is being paid out. Some years it's larger, some years it's less. But
Mhm.
this chart shows by year the amount of the PFD as it would be under statutory, under the 50/50 plan, Hammond's 50/50 plan, and what it is as a result of the legislature using PFD cuts to balance the budget.
And this little number here, that red line, what is that?
So
Is
that's
that
the total amount. That's the total amount of the PFD that's been taken per PFD over the 9 years.
oh, okay.
It's 14,963 at present through FY20 through calendar year 24. So roughly $15,000 has been per PFD has been taken out of the hands of every Alaska man, woman, and child and diverted to government in order to fill that hole that government's created.
Yeah, like I said, that statement is just enraging. And then so here finally we'll get to the now you see that one.
Right, right.
Okay, yeah, this is by income bracket that we were talking about. And again, like I said, as it gets to the top 25%, they're not sweating 2%, whatever that much. But that, like I said, by the time you get to the lower 25, you're talking 15%. That's hard to do without.
Yeah. So there's three things on this slide. The columns are the average income in Alaska by income bracket. So for example, the average income in the top 1% adjusted gross income is about $1.5 million per year. That's the average income. The average income in the lowest 25 bracket is about $18,000 per year.
Mm.
The red line is the amount that the PFD cut takes from the income of Alaska families in each of those brackets. So the top 1%, PFD only takes 0.3% of their income. hardly noticeable.
Yeah.
By the time you get to the bottom 25%, though, it takes 15% of the average household in the bottom 25%. What Matt Berman, a professor at ICER, has pointed out is we're driving Alaska families into poverty. By taking that money out of their income, we're pushing some Alaska families into the poverty levels. And when you push them into poverty levels, you increase government spending to respond to that. So we're
Right.
so we're in this
So
death spiral
yeah, yeah,
of taking money out of their pockets, pushing more of them to poverty, having to increase government spending to respond to that poverty, and then taking even more out of their pockets to respond to the fact we pushed them into poverty. There's two other things about this slide that's important. One is it isn't just the low 25% that are being affected. It's the upper middle income and the lower middle income that are being affected as well. Upper middle has average income of about 87,000. Lower middle has average income about 47,000. We're taking more from those families as well as than we're taking from the top 25%. Not as
yeah,
much as we're taking from the low 25%, but more than we're taking from the top 25%.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
final thing on that slide is the gold dotted line that goes
Mhm.
through the slide. That is about the 3.9% level. And if you averaged out the take, if you took the entire amount we're taking by the PFD and took it as a percent of total income, in other words, a flat tax across all the income brackets, that's what the tax rate would be, about 3.9%.
Mhm.
And as you can see, for upper middle, lower middle, and the low 25, they would pay less. They would lose less of their income by
Mhm.
having the amount being taken out as a flat tax as opposed to having it taken out by PFD cuts.
Yeah.
So the only ones that are benefiting by using the PFD cut approach as opposed to a flat tax approach are the top 25%.
Mhm. Yeah.
The other 75% of Alaska families are losing money as a result of using that approach.
Yeah. And this is kind of why it's no mystery. You don't hear a ton about this. Um, yeah, the donor class. So I think we've done a pretty good job of outlining the problem here. Let's say Brad Keithley was king of Alaska for a short amount of time, and he could make whatever changes you saw would make the biggest difference for people. What would those be?
So two things. One would be to redo oil taxes in a way that reflects the current reality. The way we've set up oil taxes is about 10 years old now, and it's showing some creaks. That system is showing some creaks and some cracks in it. We should redo that, update it, make it more modern, make it tied to the current circumstances. That would raise about 400 to 500 million dollars. With a deficit of about 1.4 billion dollars, that's not going to cover it, but it's going to do something toward reducing the impact. And then the second thing I'd do is use that gold line that we had on the last chart. I'd use the average tax. Everybody has the same share of income. Everybody has skin in the game, and they have the same share of skin in the game. That would do two things.
Mhm.
One, it would even the distribution, make the distribution much more fair than the regressive system we've got now.
Yeah.
But it would do a second thing. The top 25% right now really don't care about spending
Hmm.
because they don't have to contribute to it.
Yeah. Right. Right.
They get off with just a little bit taken out of their pocket through PFD cuts, but they get to retain the major share of the remainder of their income. If we used a flat tax, if we used an average rate approach, then the top 25% would pay the same as everybody
Yeah.
else as a share of their income. And all
Yeah.
of a sudden, things like increased K through 12 spending, increased university spending, increased spending on this, increased
Yeah.
capital spending, all of those things that don't affect them now because we're using PFD cuts to pay for it,
Right.
all of a sudden those would be meaningful.
Right.
And what we would have is a bigger pushback on
Hmm.
spending in the
Yeah.
state as a result of the top 25% having to contribute at the same level.
Oh, I like it. I like it. And that was gonna be my next question is what so this all kind of started in 2016. What have we been spending on since then that has required the rest of us to fork over the percentage income?
Well, it really hasn't been on K through 12. It's been on things like restoring the university. It's been
Ah,
things like on Medicare, the state share of Medicare. It's been the state share of
mm,
various other things. Increased capital spending over that period of time. Increased number of employees. Increased wages for the employees. I mean, that's
oh
sort of
God. All things we
that's
could that are gonna really be more strongly considered if everyone has to again, and the people making the decisions are not the lowest income, but they're not represented really
as a
there.
result of the pay raise last year. Everybody in the legislature is in the top 25%.
Oh my goodness. And I was looking at an article about that, and the guy that voted in favor of it did make a good point that if we don't make the salary of somebody in office actually something that people can live on, then only rich people are going to be in office. And he's got a point, but again, I think it's just there's more that goes into people that decide to run for office other than it being able to afford to. It's the kind of know-how and different things that come with that usually will result in you having a higher income. So I don't know. I don't know if I like I said, I just thought it was an interesting point.
I don't argue so much with the increase, and I agree that that point has some validity. But here's the problem:
Mm.
now that they're in office, they're voting their self-interest to use
Yeah.
PFD cuts to pay for government, to push the obligation off on the remaining 75% of Alaska families.
Mhm.
They're voting for their self-interest as opposed to what's in the good of all Alaska families.
Right,
And they're
right.
responding to the pushback to the push of their donors
Mhm.
to use PFD cuts because their donors are also in the top
Yeah, yeah,
25%,
absolutely.
and they don't want to pay a share of the cost of government.
Yeah, and the other thing I always see kind of looped into that top 25 is a non-resident. Now,
Yep.
if you ask me, those are the people that we should be taxing the most.
Well, and PFD cuts tax them zero.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
so PFD cuts only affect Alaskans. If we tax non-residents, about 10% of what we pay currently would be paid by the non-residents.
Hmm.
We would have a reduction in what Alaskans are paying just because a portion of it would be picked up by non-residents.
Wow.
But we don't do. But using PFD cuts, we don't do that.
Yeah, and it seems
But
like that would be a real easy thing for somebody in the legislature to push to run on.
but the challenge with that, Matt, is to get to the non-residents, you got to tax the top 25% too.
Yeah.
You can't come up with a system that just taxes non-residents. You have to tax
Mm,
non-residents on the same basis that you're taxing residents. You can't
right.
discriminate against non-residents. So
Yeah.
you'd have to come
Mm,
up with a sales tax or a flat tax or an
yeah.
income tax, and that would affect the top 25% also. What they're doing is they're saying, okay, we're gonna force Alaskans to pay 10% more than they would because we're not going to tax non-residents. But guess what happens to us? What happens to the top 25%? We don't have to pay anything.
Yeah.
So it's worth protecting us by not having to pay anything and pushing 10% more of the cost down on middle and lower income Alaska families to avoid opening up to non-residents and then having to tax ourselves.
Yeah. Well, oh yeah. So as we're coming up on the end here, one more thing. Um, PFD board. Is there anything you would suggest in reforming that or changes that should be made there? Because I know they've kind of been in the news lately. And like I said, one of the things that was kind of shocking to me was who some of the members are. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So the permanent fund board is composed of anymore is sort of composed of the governor's friends and their sort of political appointments. In other states that have similar boards and other nations that have similar boards, they have a requirement that the board members have expertise and knowledge on the investment industry, on what you're doing down there, what the permanent fund board is doing. They're supposed to be making investments. We've got a bunch of non-experts on the board, and they're making decisions based on political considerations as opposed to what's in the best investment interest of the state. So I
Makes
changed the
perfect
board.
sense. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And yeah, like I said, one of the members is a daughter of the CEO of Cargill, and I mean, when you talk about top 25%, that's top 1%. I mean, that's those people have some serious pull. Um,
Well, and we've got other members who have been, political cronies of the governor, but have never had investment experience,
yeah,
have never have
is
never
it,
had to deal in the investment world.
we got Hunter Biden. Is he going to be on the PFD board anytime soon? Um, yeah, and then I also heard you talk a little bit about just the media. Like I said, this is just something that does not come up anywhere in media. I'm a very small voice in this whole matter. If you're doing what you can, what would you like to see though from maybe some of the more quote unquote mainstream?
We just went through an experience that just really agitates me. The governor, who claims he wants a full PFD, that he's a
Hmm.
full PFD advocate, we just announced the new PFD level. In prior years, the governor's announced how much the cut was.
Hmm.
He hasn't gone into the distributional analysis, but he's announced how much the cut was. So how much government is retaining of your PFD, how much your PFD is being taxed. He's not even doing that anymore. So what I'd like to see is legislators talk about PFD cuts and the impact of PFD cuts on Alaska families, and the media would pick that up.
Right, right.
It
That's a
may
good
be a
point.
little bit much to ask the media to pick it up blind without anybody referring to it, or just you and me referring to it.
Hmm.
But if legislators talked about the amount of the PFD cut and the disproportionate effect it had on Alaska families, then I think the media would follow on and start covering it better.
Yeah. I talked to Mike Cronk, who's running for Senate, and he's at least aware of it. So would you like to highlight any other anyone in Congress that does bring it up or that deserves some recognition on that?
Ben Carpenter
Hmm.
from the Kenai
Okay.
has been very strong on trying to come up with a fiscal policy for the state,
Mm,
a fair fiscal policy for the state. In the last session, he proposed constitutionalizing the PFD and filling the hole with a sales tax.
mm,
Sales taxes are still regressive, but they're certainly not as regressive as the PFD cut.
mm,
And I think Ben's been a great advocate in terms of trying to get us to a solid fiscal plan. There's a candidate down in Kenai, Agnes Morin,
mm,
who has talked about the importance of the PFD and the unfairness of using PFD cuts and the
mm.
need to go to other revenue sources, more fair revenue sources,
How,
to fill the hole in the budget.
how are they received by their colleagues for doing that?
Ben, I think, has been received well. He wasn't successful in pushing it through the House, but I think he's been received well.
That's
And as
good.
I'm sure you know, he's now running for the Senate
Right.
against a current senator, the incumbent Jesse Bjorkman, who's been a big advocate of using PFD cuts to fill the budget, increase
Yeah.
spending on K through
That,
12, and using PFD cuts to fill it in.
yeah, that should really be a barometer for candidacy evaluation, in my
It
opinion.
should.
That should be one of the first things that people consider. But again, it's a matter of education. People just aren't aware that it's even an issue. Um, let's see here. I have one more. What are your thoughts on lump sum PFD? Because I know that's something that's
Mm.
been discussed in the past, and if we're going to continue at the rate we are, it's something that's going to be like, well, we might as well take it because it's not going to be there. We're not going to get the lump sum, and we're just going to have it trickle out over the. I
Yeah,
don't know.
Hammond's original vision was to create the permanent fund to have earnings not only for this generation but the next generation
Mhm.
and future generations beyond. If we paid out the permanent fund in a lump sum, we'd essentially be saying to future generations, we're going to take it all now, and
Yeah,
you're on your own. And I think that's unfair.
yeah,
I think we ought to stick with Hammond's vision of making it fair across all generations,
mhm,
but we also ought to include making it fair, the revenue source we use to fill the budget, making it fair across all Alaska income brackets.
mm,
And we need to focus on that as opposed to something tricky like a lump sum payout.
yeah, yeah. When I was talking to Mike Cronk about it, because I'd seen that he had proposed something along a lump sum payout, but that was kind of his way of saying, well, yeah, we either need to do that or start spending it responsibly so that we, can stop these cuts and it's still there for future generation.
Yeah,
So I
exactly
thought,
right.
yeah, that was an interesting strategy. Cool. Well, we're getting down to it. Is there anything you want to leave the people with? Places to find you? Anything, events, things like that you got coming up prior to the election?
So Matt, the two best places, the two best ways to follow us is we do a weekly segment on the Michael Duke Show at 6 o'clock on Tuesday mornings. We usually talk about the PFD somewhere in there in the course of the show, and then I write a column weekly that appears in the Friday edition of the Alaska Landmine on the Alaska Landmine blog on Fridays, and I talk about the PFD often there. In fact, I'm working on a column on the PFD for tomorrow's landmine along the same lines you've been talking about. So
Excellent.
those who are interested in getting the numbers and following the discussion, those are the two places that at least I surface
Cool.
talking about the issue.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Brad, again, thanks for the time, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Matt, I appreciate the time. I appreciate you getting the word out there, and thanks for taking the time. And I look forward to staying in touch.
All right. No problem. Talk to you soon.